Hello, everyone. This is section 1 of session 6 of Pre-Socratics to Augustine, also called History of Philosophy 1. We began to talk about Socrates, and we are going to continue with trying to get a better sense of who Socrates is and why he is such an influential figure. And what I want to talk about today is the charge that Socrates is a sophist and what that even means. Now, if you think back to when we were talking about early Greek philosophy, we were saying that in a sense there are two groups. There are the so-called natural philosophers who offer accounts of the universe, constituents, origins of the universe. And then there were the so-called Sophists, and we mentioned Protagoras as an example. And we said that they are educators, they travel and they offer their services as teachers, and they promise that they will make you a successful person if you study with them. Now, why is it that both of these groups of people are contentious? If you study the natural world in a way where you say, really everything that there is somehow to be explained by appeal to elements or atoms. In some sense, what you're saying is that traditional religion is wrong. Because traditional religion is going to say, well, the sky is the domain of Zeus, the underworld is the domain of Hades. And if instead you say, well, actually, air and earth are elements and are natural entities, that can be understood as blasphemy. So the early Greek natural philosophers were very contested for that reason. And that is why it is a charge against Socrates that he did natural philosophy at some point. The Sophists were contested because they were, as travelers, as we mentioned before, bringing the news that people live differently at different places. Whereas if you are a traditional Athenian and you believe in your Athenian way of life, then you want to portray that as the right way to live and also as somehow the natural way to live. And then it's not a welcome idea that here are these intellectuals who say, well, but people at other places live differently, and they also think that they live in the natural way. So both of these groups are contentious, and to some extent, the charges that are brought against Socrates can be divided into two groups. And one group of charges says, well, he is a natural philosopher. So he is contentious in the way in which one half of, or one chunk of early Greek thinkers are contentious, because he discusses nature in a way that violates traditional religion. And then Socrates also didn't really believe in the gods of Greek mythology. So he's sort of like, on the whole, not in tune with traditional Greek religion. That is one set of charges. And he is charged with impiety. And the other charge is that he corrupts the young. And he's an educator, kind of like the Sophists. An educator who somehow disrupts, an educator who doesn't give you the traditional Athenian education, but something else. And today I want to talk about one dimension of the second charge, the so-called method of question and answer. When we turn to Plato's dialogues, we see that Socrates is an interlocutor who often asks the question. And then his interlocutor has to settle for an answer. And then the interlocutor gets into trouble because Socrates asks more questions. And eventually the interlocutor realizes that what comes to light is not necessarily consistent with the initial answer that was given to Socrates' question. So there's a kind of structure here, which is someone asks you a question, you pick an answer, and then you have to reply to more and more and more questions. And eventually you realize that you're no longer consistent. And that method, the method of question and answer, is a sophistic method. And it is partly on account of this that Socrates can seem to be a sophist. That method was a competitive method. It was sort of a question of winning. So if someone asks you a question and then you settle for a reply and then you answer these subsequent questions and you become inconsistent, then you lost. But if you succeed in replying in ways consistent with your initial position, then you win. Now, contests, competitions in that method were actually part of the Olympics. So that is the extent to which it was an important competitive method. In some of Plato's dialogues, one of the biggest questions that the Sophists were debating in this way comes up quite a bit, namely the question, is virtue teachable? Because that, you can see that that is the most contested thing also for the Sophists. They say, I will make you a good person when you study with me. So then the question is, can you do that? Can you make someone a good person by offering the kind of education or any kind of education that the Sophists offer? And so there is a real discussion whether education can make a person a good person. And at the end of the day, Plato thinks yes. But it is a contested question. Now, your little task for today, what I want you to do as your homework assignment, is that you write up a question and answer exchange with 5 questions and 5 replies on a different question, one that also goes to the heart of Socrates' philosophy. And that is the question whether virtue is knowledge. Socrates is presumably thinking that virtue is knowledge. Virtue is a body of knowledge. And so your assignment is, here's the question, virtue is knowledge, and you have to pick yes or no. And then you imagine 5 further questions that put this position that you have chosen to the test.